Hello, folks. Welcome to the Genuinely Interested podcast. I'm your host, Roy Bensby. This podcast is an opportunity for me to speak with some of the most interesting people I know, either with amazing talents or achievements or unbelievable life stories or just invaluable insights into areas which they have dedicated their lives to studying. I sit down with these amazing individuals from across the planet and I try to ask them questions that will hopefully help you, the listener, extract something valuable or learn something new or just hopefully get inspired by. You can find all the episodes for the podcast on all the major podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Spotify, Google, Overcast, iHeartRadio, literally all of them. It's there. If you love the show, if it adds value to your life in any way, shape, or form, please leave reviews on iTunes. It really helps grow the podcast. It puts it up there so more people can see it. You can also find all the episodes and everything else, all the information that's updated regularly on the website, which is roybensv.com, ROYBENTZVI.com, and you can sign up for updates as well. Also been updating the YouTube channel, so I've been uploading old episodes pretty much on a daily basis, so you can find it there. And in the future, I hope to make video podcasting as well. If that's something you guys want to check out and are interested in, please shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you. And also make sure to check out the social media platforms, Instagram and Twitter. I post there daily. And lastly, if you guys want to support and help grow the podcast, please go to Buy Me a Coffee or Anchor or Patreon. It is an endeavor to grow this podcast and make it what it should be. And it takes a village. So I want to thank each and every one of you for listening. I see that there are literally listeners from all over the world in each and every country. So thank you to everyone, and on to the show. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Before I present the guest this week, I just wanted to let you know that I will be starting a Clubhouse room once a week. So give me a follow on Clubhouse. I would love to continue these type of conversations on that platform for all the listeners. So once a week, I'm going to be doing that. Feel free to follow me and we'll see what days and times works for everyone. So without further ado, this week we have Elaine McMillion Sheldon. She's a filmmaker. She's an Academy Award nominated Emmy and Peabody-winning documentary filmmaker. She's based in Appalachia, and the stories and the documentaries she makes are about the people from that area, the people that are underrepresented, the people that their story would not be told otherwise, the people that society maybe has forgotten about. She tells their stories, and she does it in an absolutely fascinating and just touching way. She also won an Emmy Award for the Outstanding Short Documentary for Heroine. Amazing movie. It's on Netflix. Check it out. Recovery Boys is another one of her movies. We mentioned it on the podcast. It's on Netflix as well. So just amazing documentary filmmaker. If anyone that knows me knows that I'm a massive documentary fan. I love documentaries. I used to watch only documentaries. Now I'm like 50-50, a little bit more flexible nowadays. So happy to have her on the podcast. We discussed the area that she's from, West Virginia, why the stories are not being told the way they should. We also talked about the opioid epidemic, the heroin epidemic that is ravaging that area and other areas in the country. We talked about her role in the Anthony Bourdain episode in West Virginia. And we covered, I was very interested to kind of get a peek behind the camera just to talk to her about her thought process, how she approaches the subject of a documentary, the editing, how they decide what goes in, what goes out, just all these different things that I've been fascinated over the years. And she was amazing. She was an open book. She gave amazing answers. She was a really fun guest to have on. So I'm sure you guys are going to enjoy this episode as much as I did. And without further ado, I don't want to keep rambling on. I'm sure you guys want to hear the episode. So again, without further ado, here is Elaine McMillion Sheldon. Enjoy the episode, everyone.
The Genuinely Interested Podcast.
Hey, Elaine.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I anyone that knows me knows that I am a massive, and this is I can't overstate this, massive documentary fan. So I think you are, I believe you're the first documentary filmmaker I've had on. So very happy to have you on.
Yeah, I'm glad there's fans of documentary. I feel like this is a pretty recent thing over the past decade that people actually watch documentaries as a part of their regular media consumption. So that's good for the sustainability of documentary filmmakers.
You're in the right industry right now.
Right.
Why do you think that is actually? That's something obviously I wanted to ask because maybe, I don't know exactly, but if I had to guess 15, 20 years ago, probably not as popular. And then in the last, roughly 10 years, there's just been this spike in the documentary content and they're more popular than ever. And actually people like binge watching it on Netflix. Like, why do you
Yeah.
think they're so popular now?
I think, well, I mean, documentaries have had such a short history compared to other like art forms and media and it's just been accessibility all along. So where did you even watch a documentary before streaming services? You know, you had to catch it on PBS or you'd catch it on a broadcast and it just wasn't accessible. And I think the topics were more narrow and they were more rooted in things like history and journalism and those types of things which don't always attract a younger audience. And so, you know, you had Ken Burns making these epically
Yeah.
long documentaries for PBS, which God bless him. That man has some stamina for all the work he's done. And he's a legend. But now I think the door's been opened up a lot because there's a lot more places to see documentaries, but also the camera gear is inexpensive. So I've been making documentaries since like 2000, I guess, when like 2008 was probably the first time I made a documentary. And the Canon 5D came out that year, and that camera sort of revolutionized the ability for a person like myself to make an image that wasn't just a video camera looking image. So camera access, access to streamers, just more voices, more people in the world, like telling their perspectives. There's just more space. And people want to see it. It's really interesting. I mean, I never, it's amazing how many people have seen my films because I just don't, especially because of Netflix. Two of them are on Netflix. So if you get on an airplane, people ask you what you do, and you say documentary filmmaker. A lot of people have seen at least one of the films that are on Netflix, and it's always been shocking to my husband and I because it's documentaries. Like not
Yeah.
it used to be like documentaries were sort of the eat your vegetables of film. You know, people
Yeah.
didn't see them as something they sought out. So it's a different world.
I
Now we're
think,
kind of in the opposite where it's like there's too much.
oh,
Now
yeah.
there's like too much to watch.
Well, there's too much of everything. There's just too much content, period. And
Yeah.
like you can spend your whole life and you won't be able to consume even a small percentage. But it's so true what you said about the films, how they're the eat your veggies equivalent. I feel like it was more like when I was a kid. I remember like very young. If my dad were to say something like, "Let's watch a documentary," I'm like, oh, really? Like I'm not
Yeah.
interested. It's just like something old people do, and now that whole thing, that whole paradigm's kind of been switched on its head, where you have, and I don't know if this is there's some bad in this as well because obviously like there's a whole amount, there's a lot of like YouTube documentaries out there that are probably it's just a lot of conspiracy stuff, not really rooted in facts or science. But that like personally got me into documentaries like early on when I was like a teenager. I was like, oh wow, like look at that. Like I didn't know that. And like you feel like you're privy to this new knowledge right through the internet. And I feel like
Right.
now it's become cool to watch documentaries and cool to have the knowledge that documentaries provide.
Yeah. Yeah. And the fact that sort of documentary filmmakers operate on their own code of ethics is an interesting thing to consider too, because you mentioned like what's true and what's factual. And, if you work for if you make a film for Netflix or PBS, they're going to do a fact check, a legal check to make sure that everything that is said can be verified, but
Mhm.
not so much for everyone else. So you can pretty much put up whatever you want and call it nonfiction. And
Yeah.
so yeah, It's an interesting time.
It is. So let's talk a little bit about you. You were born in West Virginia, correct?
I was actually born in Virginia, but I grew up in West Virginia, so
Okay.
same old, same old.
Yeah, very close. Still Virginia. And and you focus mainly, or I don't know if solely, but I think you and your husband focus mainly on stories from that region.
Yeah, yeah, we mostly document stories within Appalachia, Central Appalachia. So that's Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, parts of PA, North Carolina, and I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee, so parts of East Tennessee.
And I mean, why did you decide to particularly focus on that area? Just because something you grew up in, or maybe you felt it was an underrepresented area and the stories just weren't being told?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I grew up here, so I care about this place. This place is also um, not a lot of people live here that are part of the media and they're part of the filmmaking community. So most of the stories get told by people dropping in for a few days. And so that means they spend about 3 days telling a pretty complex story, which is not enough time to tell a complex story. So yeah, I grew up with a lot of really bad representations of Appalachia. I mean, most people, when they think of Appalachia, they're not thinking of the most flattering image. It's been used for like the face of especially white poverty, which is like the biggest thing that Appalachia is, the black and white photos of little dirty faced kids on front porches shoeless. That's like the war on poverty images from the 60s that still are like what people think of today, which is crazy
Yeah.
because not everybody has an experience with Appalachia. And so, I grew up pretty aware that the media that represented where I was from, like, didn't actually represent where I was from at all. So yeah, I mean, I left West Virginia and left Appalachia for a while because I didn't think I really cared that much. I was like one of those people that wanted to leave and left, and lived in Boston, lived in Miami, lived in New Orleans, lived all over, and then decided to come back and tell stories that I felt were being overlooked. So yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I can totally relate to that. I mean, I 8 years ago I left my home country and I came to the US. And I feel like there's always this, you always want to better yourself, right? So if you want to leave your small town and you want to go to the big city, or you want to leave your small country and you want to come to the US because you want to live that American dream. But after a few years, and I've been here, like I said, about 8 years now, you get to this point where you're like, you know what? Like I miss some of that of what I grew up on. Like I miss family, I miss friends, I know that authenticity that comes from being who you are in the place that you're from. And it's always that battle that you're like, okay, I'm losing a little bit of myself in order for in my own head to propel myself forward, in a financial way, or I don't know, be more
Yeah.
successful, whatever it is.
Where are you from originally?
Israel.
Cool. Yeah, no, I think it's sad how rooted like we once were and how we don't value that anymore. I think that's really kind of tragic. Like we've all bought into the idea of being like a homogenous pool of people rather than embracing accents and embracing, like, we've belittled all the things that come from small places,
Hmm.
in sacrifice of small places have been sacrificed for large places too. I mean, even if you look at like small communities, water systems being pumped to like cities, so like there's just this like constant sacrifice of small places for big places. And those of us who feel a deeper connection to place and land and people and community, when you leave that, you think that's what you should be doing, right? This is
Yeah,
progress, this is like what
yeah,
we're doing, and you in so many other ways you're going to have a better life, whether it's financially or whatever. But there's like a soul part of you, like a heart part of you, that's left behind in a certain place. So yeah, I mean, my family's been in Appalachia, specifically like up one holler in West Virginia on the same tract of land now for, well, they've been in the region for 9 generations. I'm the ninth
wow,
generation. So it's pretty
wow.
deep, and it's
That's
it's
deep.
hard to not look at photos from the 1800s of like your logging family who lived there before anyone lived there. other than Native Americans, and were like just barefoot and making a go at it. I mean, they were like hardy people and not just
Yeah.
kind of feel like a wuss. You're like, oh, these
Oh,
people
my
were the
coffee's
real
not hot enough
deal.
this morning. Yeah.
Yeah, these
I
people were the real deal.
I always think about that, about these first explorers. I think I literally mentioned this in like half my podcast because it's just such a mind fuck to me that these people, think about people that came to like to the US, 400 or 500 years ago, or any place, right? Like Iceland or Norway,
No,
whatever. Like they came on these boats, no GPS, no refrigerated food. I don't know. Sometimes no clothes. They don't know what the conditions. They don't know what the weather is going to be, and somehow they make their way up to wherever they are, right? Like cold areas, hot areas, and they settled and they made food. And I'm like, wow, how
it's
how on how on
insane.
earth? And we can barely be outside for 20 minutes without catching a cold. Like
Yeah. No
different,
hospitals, no stores,
no
everything you had
antibiotics.
to make yourself.
Yeah,
I know. I'm like, and we're like, yeah, we don't survive in a winter when we have homes and lots of
exactly.
clothing, right?
Yeah.
It is really, really wild. And my I guess it was like two like a great great grandpa or where something. So my pawpaw's dad, I guess when he was a teenager, his mom just sent him and his brother like go across the mountain and find a piece of land. So they literally went on foot and like had a donkey, I think, and went from Wise, Virginia to Nicholas County, West Virginia. And that's where like my cousins now live on that land, and like we've been there for a long time. But they just sent their teenage son to be like, go find land. And this is like hostile land,
Yeah.
this wasn't, it's not,
Wild animals.
it's, yeah, it's wild.
Yeah,
Yeah,
nowadays you won't let your kid out on the front porch for 5 minutes. So yeah, we've come a long way. I don't know if it's up or down. I mean, I guess it's, I don't know. I never like to make us like an overarching statement about one thing. I think obviously in certain things we've developed and we were much better, and then
absolutely.
but it's a trade off. We've lost some things.
Yeah, we have. No, there's no need to romanticize that era, because that era had its problems just as much as ours does, if not more. And so we are living in an age where we are probably the most comfortable, but the most complaining. But at the same time, like I would love to just time travel, drop in for a day and just see what life was like. I
What
don't know
year
that
would
I
you
could have
choose?
lived. Oh, what year? I think it would be really interesting to be in West Virginia actually like during the Civil War, because so the state became a state in 1863.
Hmm.
And that was because it split from Virginia, because it joined the Union and left the Confederacy. And that is when a lot of my family was living there, and they were living there because they didn't want to fight and they were getting captured. Like the Confederate troops were coming through and like forcing them to fight, and Union troops too. And I think that would be an incredible time to just witness. So, like, I don't know, early 1860s, right before it became a state. I think it would be a really fascinating time to see. And that was like very early days of industrial development in the state. So, like coal and salt mines and all that stuff. I mean, it was an ugly period, but it would be really cool to see.
Well, especially for you, you love stories, all right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's your
right.
whole thing. Like when and is this something you always had, or when did you know you love stories and that you want to be a storyteller?
Yeah, no, I think storytelling is part of, like, there's a really strong oral storytelling tradition in Appalachia. And so I just grew up listening to stories. And so, and like half those stories are lies, right? Like
Yeah.
everything's sort of like a long tail. And so I became a storyteller at a young age just because you tell stories. And so, I just was a kid really interested in other people and journaling and writing, and always just wanted to tell stories from a pretty young age. Yeah.
And I mean, you made an amazing documentary, Heroin. It's one of the two that are on Netflix.
Yeah.
The other is Recovery Boys. And what made you kind of go in that direction and want to make that film?
So I had made a couple films of just about things like health, economics, at least things in West Virginia and other places. But I, in 2016 and 2015, it was like every time I had called home or went home, it would be another person I knew that had died of a drug overdose, or another person I knew who was, you'd see their mugshot in the newspaper. It was overwhelming, the number of people, especially women that I went to middle school and high school with, that were losing custody of their kids. It was just a mess. And I kind of avoided it as a topic for a while because it was just so ugly, and I didn't know how to look at it without like just being pained.
Yeah.
Um, and so we decided to my husband Curran and I decided to go and look for people who are actively trying to do something about it. That became our angle. So we found these three incredible women in Huntington, West Virginia, who are working at different levels of government and community. So one's a fire chief who is actually reviving people and saving lives. One's a drug court judge who runs a rehabilitation court system there in the county. And then one's a street missionary who goes and helps women trapped in addiction in sex work, actually like get them into recovery and rehab. And so we found these sort of like change maker solution people as a way to tackle this story that had become so raw to so many people. And then Recovery Boys, kind of the same thing. One of my former journalism professors told me about a rehab that was opening on a farm. And I thought, what a beautiful story of like connecting people, not just to back into themselves and to a community, but to the land, which is something that I personally would love to see happen all across the country more, is just people valuing land and environment more. And so, once we found those two stories of sort of reinvention, we could think of the opioid crisis not as this like plague where all the visuals we were showing would just be these, very depressing things. We didn't want to put more of that out there. There's plenty of that out there. So once we
Yeah.
found these two stories, we kind of just dove in.
Why do you think, in your opinion, and now you have a expertise in this field, why do you think the opioid epidemic hit that area so hard?
I think two things happen. There was a lot of overprescribing and just straight up dumping of pills into the region. So the demand was created with a huge amount of supply. And so there's a lot of people that need to pay. And there's a lot of lawsuits right now showing as much. The region was no doubt targeted because it had all the signs and symbols of communities in pain. So you have low economic and health outcomes, you have lower access to actual doctors and hospitals. If you are in pain or if you need help or alternative forms of help, it's harder to get them. So give them a pill.
Yeah.
And you have high rates of depression and loneliness and isolation because, so many of the things that people did for work and for community were disappearing. And so we all want to feel a sense of belonging. We all want to feel like we're contributing something to society. And I think that the economic collapse in the region didn't help the addiction rates when they started skyrocketing. And now we're, unfortunately, it's not just my generation, it's the generation before that sort of was roped in. And then my generation is probably the most that have died. And now we have kids that are growing up without without their parents, with grandparents. And it's just really hard to know how that generation is going to turn out. We have a lot of kids in foster care. But yeah, it's just like it's a really ugly generational sort of tangle that I don't really know how you fix. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't want to like sound too depressing, but it's I know it's happening all across, right? I know Camden, New Jersey has a massive problem with drugs. Places in West Virginia, Ohio, just it's not specifically in West Virginia. It's happening in a lot of places, and the drugs are much stronger nowadays. And it's literally a lot of cities and maybe even states are crumbling because of drug abuse. It's just the human impact is so profound that I think in one of the in I think it was in I can remember one of the movies. I remember the someone saying like it's going to take a few generations to understand like
Yeah.
how what the impact was. Does it feel like a I don't know like a lost battle sometimes? You know, it's like it's almost like you know when you have like climate change, it's like such a big thing. You're like I don't even know where to start. It just seems like it's too big
Yeah.
for me, one person to deal with.
I feel like all the issues like climate change or drug epidemics, they're all these things, they all feel so big. They're hard to stomach and look at square on the face. And I think that's why we like to look at them through individuals making change, because it may feel very small that one person gets up every day and does this, but that's really all there is to do, right? Like that's all there, that's the only solution, is if everybody gives a damn enough to get up every day and try to make a difference. And if enough people did that, it wouldn't be a lost cause. Because essentially like addiction doesn't thrive in societies where you're well connected, where you have community, where you have resources, where you aren't alone. Addiction thrives with isolation and loneliness and depression. And so, you saw the guys in Recovery Boys do really well when they were tapped into a community, and particularly like farming and doing things with their body, with the land, meeting other people, volunteering, like when they're actively plugged into a community. But then when they leave rehab and they're back on their own, and their only people they know are their family who also use drugs, and they can't get a job because the job market's desolate, and they also, the jobs they can get are depressing jobs, then like, yeah, I'd start using drugs too, because your existence is so bleak. Like, what do you do? Like, I'm actually more surprised after making the films we made that more people. It shows me more. It gives me more hope about human resilience that so many people seek recovery, because you're once you've used drugs for, I don't know, some people have used drugs for 10 years, right? And your life gets such in shambles. You've lost all connections, you've lost your kids, you've lost everything. Like at some point you have to have enough human resilience within you to not want to die, right?
Yeah,
And a
yeah.
lot of people make that choice to like want to live and to want to change. And I find that amazing, because even when you're in recovery, even if you're like 5 years clean, you're doing good, you still have a record, you're still a felon. People are still stigmatizing you. Like there's still so much up against you. Like getting clean is sort of the first step, and then steps 2 through 20 are the rest of your life. Like it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
So I mean it gives me hope that people seek it out every day to want to improve their life. And I think that's why it's not a lost cause. If we had like an entire generation that didn't want their life to change, knowing they're going to have setbacks, because addiction is incredibly like it's a brain, it's like in your brain is formed around the habit.
Hmm.
So yeah, it doesn't feel too big. I think we can, I mean, this is not the first drug epidemic we've been through, and we need to be looking at communities of color who have been through other drug epidemics that we've totally ignored and locked up and thrown away, um, and look at sort of what's worked for them on a grassroots level. And yeah, it is pretty daunting, but I do think it comes down to just people caring about one another. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I think we generally tend to discard or not care as much about poorer communities. Doesn't matter if they're white, if they're black, Latino. Just generally, if you know if this was happening in I don't know, take some wealthy neighborhood. Doesn't matter if it's west side of Upper West Side in New York or Beverly Hills, it would get a lot more attention, right? If you had
Yeah.
wealthy kids dying or wealthy parents dying, obviously this would get much more attention. But poor people who don't have representation, who no one knows because a lot of times live in rural areas. It's very easy for the media to just not really care about it too much.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I'm, I might be a little controversial, but I honestly think so much of our current issues are boiled down to right wing media and left wing media. And you have CNN, MSNBC on one end, and you have Fox News on the other end, and they're telling two completely different stories, and they're just pitting the two camps against one another,
Yeah.
and they're not really giving us news and journalism and telling us what the facts are. They're just pushing an agenda or pushing the political, whatever it is of the day. And I think that is doing so much harm to this country. And maybe this is another reason why documentaries are so, um, popular right now.
Yeah, no, it's true. And, the opioid epidemic or crisis, whatever you call it, wasn't a crisis or epidemic until rich kids started dying, right? Like it was raging in Appalachia for 2 decades almost. The pill mills in the 90s that I grew up, like in my community, where people were lying down the streets waiting for a non doctor, some random person to write on a prescription pad their Oxycontin or whatever because there was so much overprescribing. It hasn't been happening in the 90s. So like people were dying and they called it a pillbilly problem then because it was poor people, right? It was like poor
Hillbilly.
hillbillies. Yeah.
I've never heard
So
that.
until like upper class or upper middle class and upper class kids in Connecticut and elsewhere started dying and their parents have more influence and they started asking questions, then that's when we had an opioid epidemic. Before it was just poor people being irresponsible.
Hillbilly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have
But yeah,
you?
no, the media doesn't help. And it's really hard to see because I went to journalism school. And so it kind of tears me up. I actually always do like, I'll go to foxnews.com and CNN, and you literally, it's almost like they take each other's templates and just reverse them. And
Yeah.
that's what they publish. And it's mind blowing and it's not helpful. And I think it's actually closing more people off to just becoming ignorant than it is, you know, I don't know. I don't know what the goal is, what the end goal is.
Well, the goal is to make people scared, and once you're scared, people act in a certain way, and people. I don't know if the end goal is to divide the country and pit, left against right, religious against non-religious, white against black. They're doing a good job because right now I feel like the country, and I was not born here, so but I've if you live abroad, you might not know what's happening in Finland or Spain, but you know what's happening in the U.S. Like you're always aware of what's happening in the U.S. Doesn't matter where you live in the world, and I just don't think the U.S. has ever been so divided. And it's you really feel it not only on social media, but you really feel it in the streets. And I think it really boils down to the media. It's just and if every journalist I talk to, they agree. They're like, yeah, it's bad, but they don't know what the answer is. They don't have
Yeah.
solutions.
Yeah. Also, it's always good to think about. It's hard to think about context of history. It's like our division previously. Like think about segregation, how there was a black water fountain and a white water fountain. Like there was such a physical manifestation of division, right? Like America was severely divided. A black kid couldn't even go to a white school. So like that division was a one that physically stopped bodies from doing something, which is seems to us to be crazy now, right? But our division now is this sort of like lurking thought and malice online that is it like seeps in different ways, and so it's just it is really interesting. But on like a day to day basis, just living your life, and if you know your neighbors and if you're tapped into your community, you don't feel divided. That's what's frustrating to me. Is like,
Hmm.
I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. On this street that I live on, there could be a Biden, Trump, rainbow, a sign that says "We don't discriminate," a sign that's like Republican. Like this community is a really interesting one to look at because it's like East Tennessee's part of Appalachia, but it's also a really diverse community here. And it's not like everybody gets their own long hunky dory, but we all coexist, and it doesn't feel like so angry. But when you just see on the media like just this anger and vitriol and bullying constantly, that you're just kind of like, oh my God, this is the country. But on a community level, it doesn't feel as divided. And so I hope other people live in communities where they can feel that too, because that's like the only hope, right? And yeah,
Well, it's become a weird thing where if you disagree with someone, that automatically makes them bad, and you should automatically be angry with them because they have an opposing opinion. And if you're doesn't matter if you're progressive, if you're liberal, if you're conservative. there should be a space for everyone to have difference of opinions. You're just never going to agree with any. There's not a single human out there that I agree on everything with. It's just never going to exist. So yeah, I don't know what this new thing is. Like, you have to agree with me about everything, otherwise you are bad, and I will try to
Yeah.
cancel you, and I will try to get you fired. Very, very weird. I don't know. We're living in weird times right now, and social media um, hypes that up to takes it to level 100 so quickly.
Mhm.
Yeah. Did you get any you know, I can go on a whole rant about this. I'm trying not to. Did you get any emails, letters from people after watching the movies, you know, saying something like, you know, I'm so glad you told the story, or you helped
Yeah.
me see something that I wasn't aware of before, something along those lines?
So many, and so many, especially after, well, after both, but especially after Heroin, because it got nominated for an Oscar. So people like started seeing it, it started, like got a new audience when it starts getting promoted, and
Hmm.
it's on a billboard in LA, and like people start seeing it. And so it got much more attention than Recovery Boys. And the three women in the film were getting emails daily. I mean,
Yeah.
and letters in the mail thanking them, and lots of people reaching out asking how they could help. The one person reaching out saying, I decided to watch this and was about to shoot up and decided, like, you know what, I'm not going to, like,
Wow.
literally, like, writing these really intense emails. Lots of people in recovery thanking for showing like the good, bad, and ugly, like not just showing everything bad and not just showing everything rosy. Lots of young women that want to be leaders the same way those women are, thanking them. So yeah, it was pretty amazing how long, and they still get emails. I mean, it's not daily anymore, but they still get emails. And Jan Rader, who was the fire chief in the film, she was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people the year the
Oh,
film
wow.
came out.
Really?
Yes, so like these women have been working tirelessly in their communities for years, like almost 30 years. And we just happened to come in and film 30 days with them,
Yeah.
and was able to like really amplify their voices. So that was awesome. They got to meet President Obama and Michelle Obama at the
Wow.
Obama Foundation Summit. And there's just a lot of things that felt really good to see them be thanked for the work they did, without cameras around for years. So yeah, lots of good came from both of those films, I think. And the guys in Recovery Boys even get messages, which I always worry about because people can be mean on the internet, as we know. And these guys are in recovery, and sometimes some days are easier for them than others. But they've told me that a majority of the messages are just messages of support.
It's amazing.
Really cool.
And I'm interested in, like, in your approach to shooting. So because I'm assuming you go and you tag along to these women, or how whatever movie it is that you're doing. I'm assuming it's a process, right? Like, how do you get to how do you people have to let their guard down, they have to be vulnerable, they have to be honest around the camera. That's, I'm assuming, the good stuff. I don't know how long you shoot, like how many hours of film do you have in order to edit it down to like a 30-minute movie, but I'm assuming it's a lot of hours.
Yeah.
And how do you kind of approach people? How do you, like, do you have to like build a relationship beforehand? Do you just come on? Like, what's the process?
Yeah, the cameras don't come out the first day. Typically, you're doing like phone calls with them or messages with them, just getting to know them, showing your interest, trying to like build trust, and showing that you're reliable and will do what you say and say what you do and all those things. And then you show up and maybe you do an interview with them so that you can sort of get inside their head a little bit, understand where they're coming from. And then you may, go home, take a break for a couple days, and then come back and say, "Hey, do you mind if I just follow you, fly on the wall?" For the next 4 hours. And you put the camera down. The following 4 hours you just eat dinner with them, or with the guys, like load hay bales into the actually like work with them on the farm. It's important to spend not equal amounts of time off camera and on camera, but a pretty large percentage of your time is spent off camera, just being a human being among these people, because the fact is, like, they're expecting you, because of people's opinions of the media and film, they're expecting you to sort of be a vulture in that sense of like coming in for what you want and then leaving. And so Karen and I always made space and room to just be around, because the relationship you build off camera is what makes the on camera stuff you get actually more intimate, and they ignore you better, or they open the door during a hard time. In Recovery Boys, things didn't go well for all the guys, and we were just really grateful that we had a good relationship that we had built over a year, basically, that in the last 6 months when things were falling apart with some of them, they still were willing to open the door. And they didn't feel like we were there to exploit them. And it's hard, though. It's really difficult to document. It's easier to document people when they're on the up and like
Yeah.
doing well. And then when you see the crash and you're sitting there with the camera, you kind of feel like, what am I doing here? And like, am I really being helpful? And how can I be helpful? And, this is going to follow them. They're just, Adam's in his 20s and this is going to be on Netflix. Like, how's he feel about this? And at the end of the day, you just kind of have to like constantly be checking yourself ethically to see when you're pushing too much and what your relationship is. And it's hard though. Like you get really, really, really close with people and then the film ends. And then you want to keep up that relationship, but it can never be like we still talk to them. Absolutely. Like we're still in touch with everyone, but it's never going to be as close as it is when you're filming, when you're actually like seeing people overcome things.
Yeah.
And they know so much about them, right? Like you've interviewed them, their whole backstory. You've seen every like hard part of their life, every beautiful part of their life, and they hardly know anything about you. And so it's a really weird thing. So Karen and I always try to like put the cameras down and talk about ourselves, like be vulnerable ourselves. And, um, you know, so yeah, it's a long process. There's no like dropping in and dropping out to get stuff that feels like it goes beneath the surface. It takes a while. I mean, we filmed the guys in Recovery Boys over 18 months.
Wow.
Yeah. And building trust at the beginning was hard because we weren't like casting these guys. It was like whoever showed up at the rehab was in the film and they had to agree to be part of the film. So not all the guys in the rehab wanted to be part of the film. So we had to shoot around some guys and yeah.
Watching faces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you feel sometimes that it just being there, right? Like just documenting, you're changing the reality of what is happening for good or bad, right? Like could be that maybe some guy is thinking, oh, this is going to be a film. I should really try more because of it, or maybe whatever it is that's happening. Like just you being inserted into that situation kind of changes the dynamics a little bit.
I think it's impossible for you to be there with the camera and not change the dynamics. Even if you're like us and you're hands off, like we don't interject. If we miss something, we don't ask people to do it again. Like we don't ask people to act. We don't ask people to walk through the frame. We don't ask questions if we missed it. If we missed it, it's our bad.
And that
Like we
happens in
don't.
documentaries all the time.
No, yeah, yeah. It's a very standard thing that people get asked to repeat things or to do things over, but we don't do it because it just makes them that much more aware that they're being filmed and makes them feel like actors in their own world, and that's just weird. So, yes, I think the camera has a really big influence, and I also think, in some ways, based on your relationship with people, you're kind of a cheerleader for them, and so they may be you're not the only cheerleader, but they may be wanting to do more and better in their life because there's a camera, right? And um,
Yeah.
in the case of Recovery Boys, you see like several of them sort of like go between this like yo-yo effect, and I always wondered if we were sort of lucky. All those guys are still alive, and for four guys who are addicted to heroin to still be alive, when we filmed that in 2016. And that's very uncommon. Like heroin kills so many people, and for a sample size of four guys to still be living, and I have a hard time believing the film wasn't a part of that sort of yo-yo effect of like when they did relapse. I mean, I know Adam told us he'd watched the film and it like reminded him, like he got to see himself healthy. Like if he would relapse and he already saw the film had already been out and he would see it, he'd be like, oh my God, like I gotta get back there. Like I was healthy. So having a documentation, and this is post filming, right? Like this is not even during filming. So it's impossible to really measure the reality versus the influence you're having, but we, as much as possible, just try to stay out of the way. But yeah, I mean, I would act differently if the camera was following me around. You
Yeah.
know, I wouldn't do certain things. So it's like impossible to say that's not the case.
I hate when there's like these documentaries where they'll have like the shot where the guy's opening the door and he's like, "Hey guys," but just like a second before, like you saw him walking to the door from the inside. So it's like, wait, what's happening? Like, there's obviously a crew
Please pause.
inside. It's like
Yeah,
I hate that. Yeah, I hate
yeah.
I hate when they're acting. Like, don't act.
Yeah, no, it's true. And yeah, reality TV is sort of made you have to sort of break people from that because if their only relationship with seeing nonfiction, air quotes, I'm doing air quotes, nonfiction is reality TV where like you see a guy walk in the door, cut, see the guy he's coming in the door, then they think that's what you want. And you
Yeah,
have to just tell them like, no, don't look at me, don't do anything for me. Do what you're gonna do without me.
yeah.
And so you have to sort of break people's habits of thinking that they are actors because so much of what they've seen has been, people acting out their lives in a nonfiction way.
No, I love it when it's raw, and I love that rawness in everything. I love it in documentaries. I love it in podcasts. I don't know, YouTube, whatever I'm watching. Like, I don't like when it's like highly edited. And
Hmm.
I think why these formats are like maybe more popular now because we have been editing for so long, right? And like just what we were saying about the news earlier, why they'll give you they'll talk about a subject that we can talk about on the podcast for an hour, and we can dissect the nuance of it, and we can bring all the layers. And there they'll talk about it for 2 minutes,
Hmm.
as if you can really cover a topic like that in 2 minutes. And then
Hmm.
if they do have people to talk about it, they'll have all these bobbleheads screaming one over and the other. No one really knows what anyone is saying, and you're not really getting anything out of it. And the whole thing just is very, like, I don't know, over its production, and it's edited,
Yeah.
and it just doesn't feel raw or authentic. And these documentaries or podcasts or this new wave of media is just so much more. It's just such a better way to connect and to um, give information to people.
Yeah. And it's those moments of sort of raw revelation moments that you can't anticipate that aren't scripted that as a documentary filmmaker you're like, this is amazing. Like when something happens that it just happens and it
Did you
could
have a
be
moment
just
like that?
there's tons of them. It's just like facial expressions and it's all a bunch of documentaries all in the subtleties. Like it's not a big flash bang medium, right? So like
Yeah.
everything's in the subtleties. And so you have to constantly just be looking for those moments where you can kind of find out what someone's thinking through a facial expression, or you can find out how they're feeling after that particular moment by their body language. And like it's your job to sort of not just document what's being said or what's like visible, but actually what's not being said. And so that's the really difficult part of making documentaries, because when you're in your early days of documentary, you're just like, oh, I gotta get the shot. You have a shot list. I gotta get the shot exterior of the building. Gotta do this, and you're like thinking it's a very methodical thing that you can just check off. But the good documentaries are the ones that like stick around when other people have stopped rolling the camera, right? And
Mhm.
so yeah, I agree. I love the rawness of it, and it's more interesting as a filmmaker to where you're not in a scripted situation, like you don't know what's going to happen next. And sometimes that's good and bad. It makes it very difficult to know what to do. Like when I was filming the scene with Jeff in jail, or sorry, when he was arrested afterwards and he was in the courtroom. First of all, I didn't even know he was arrested. We couldn't find him. And then somehow I was constantly like checking the local jails to make sure none of the guys were booked. And I was 2 hours away and found out he was in the county jail. And I called his lawyer and she said, oh, yeah, he has a hearing tomorrow. So I raced up there. He didn't know I was going to be there. I hadn't seen him in 3 months because he went missing.
Yeah.
And I was just so happy he was alive. And when he came through the door to come into the courtroom, he's shackled, he's in orange, he looks awful. He's so excited to see me. He's like waving like a kid. And it was just like, it was terrible for the film. Like I had to cut
Yeah.
before he starts waving at me and smiling. But it was a moment where you realize, like, it was just nice that he wasn't like, "Oh, Elaine's here," but he was
Yeah,
like, "Oh, Elaine's here." Like, there's someone I know here because there's no one else there.
yeah.
No family members there, and yeah, it's like those moments where you're kind of just like, "Oof, what is my role?" But it's those moments that also are those raw revelation moments that really strike you.
Yeah. Well, you immerse yourself, like you said. You said, I think 18 months. That's a long
Yeah,
time. That's like a relationship, especially when it's like an intense relationship where like people open up to you this whole time. And it's
yeah.
it's it's like, how do you actually because 18 months, I don't know how many hours. How do you take that down? How do you decide, all right, I'm going to do 90 minutes from I don't know, hundreds of hours potentially of shooting.
There's so much stuff that doesn't make it in. I actually was thinking the other day, like, I'd love to release some just crazy scene selects that never made it in. All the things that went wrong on the farm. Like, I was riding on the back of the four wheeler with Jeff when he was trying to herd sheep, and like, he almost killed me. And it was like a disaster. So there's like all these things
The
that
blooper
obviously
reel.
don't make it in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but you are trying to create, especially if you're telling it's easier if you're telling a story about one person, so you're following one person and you follow them through one trajectory, so it's like kind of like a plot, like a dramatic plot. So you have your first act, your second act, your third act. It's harder when it's four guys and there's no three act structure really to follow. There's no like hero's journey, all that stuff. So our editor, Penny Falk, did a really good job of what we first did is like identified probably like 20 scenes that we felt were pivotal scenes for each of the guys. They showed something about the guy's personality, their backstory, where they were going. And then it was a matter of rearranging those scenes and then creating these sort of like buffer scenes in between that were more environmental or more about their location or more about them in the rehab or more about them in their community, but it wasn't like a personal scene. So it was kind of like a peppering in of all these guys' stories. And because they all end differently and because they all have like a different tenor and tone to them, it was a matter of like, okay, let's add some positivity here, and because we're about to go somewhere dark, and then how do
Yeah.
you lift someone out of that darkness so they don't feel like they want to turn this film off, right? Like, you have to think about what the audience is thinking at the moment, when they're going to be exhausted, when they're going to be heartbroken, when they're going to be happy, um, and try to create sort of a, like it's like a piece of music. Like, you're trying to like emotionally create something that feels like a full experience. But it's a lot of cutting. I mean, the film took 8 months to edit. And so it
Wow.
took 18 months to shoot and 8 months to edit. So we had a lot of footage. I don't even know how many hours. We shot 2 to 3 days a week when they were in rehab, and they were in rehab for 6 months. And then the 12 months that followed, it was us following up with them weekly.
Wow.
So,
That's incredible.
mhm.
Um, I know we have to go soon, but I really wanted to talk to you. So a lot of people reached out to me, and for some reason, everyone specifically talked to me about the West Virginia Anthony Bourdain episode. And again, he's been all over. I don't know how many seasons. I think 11 or 12 seasons and like 8 episodes. But so many people reach out like, "Oh, I love that episode." And I think what everyone loved was he came to West Virginia in a highly partisan time, right? And he showed the humanity there. And he wasn't coming to judge and he wasn't coming to ridicule. And he was just like, I just want to connect with people. I just want to talk to them. I just want to get their perspective. And he did it in such an amazing way that I think a lot of people connected with that. And maybe some people were like, no, 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 like I still don't like them because whatever, right? But I think overall people connected to that.
Yeah.
And you were on that episode. So what was it like kind of shooting with him and talking to him?
Yeah. I'm so excited that so many people connected with that because I was contacted by the producer Morgan Fallon, who's awesome. He works for Zero Point Zero. He's worked with Tony since for a long time on that show. But Morgan actually was for a short period of his life. He lived in West Virginia, and he had been trying to get Anthony to come and do a show in West Virginia. And it wasn't until Trump got elected and like everything, like people eyes and attention was on West Virginia. So finally, there was a relevant reason to highlight West Virginia over Vietnam, right?
Yeah.
Like, generally, like if you're gonna choose, you're gonna choose Vietnam over West Virginia. Um, So there was a reason to come. There was like a hook, and Morgan was fantastic. I mean, from the first day of him producing that show, when he reached out to me, he had seen a project I did called Hollow, and he was just like, I respect everything you've done with this project. I want you to help be a field producer. So I was field producing for them, which meant I was setting up people that they should meet that should be on the show and so on and so forth. And then actually they came to West Virginia and sort of I took them around to meet people. And so I had my hand in the people they featured, not all of them, but a lot of them. Because there were people that I had already featured in documentaries. I knew that they were comfortable on camera, and I also knew that they represented like a complex version of the state. And so what was funny is they were trying to cast for that breakfast scene. They wanted someone that could talk to history, but also contemporary. And so I'd recommended Nick, who was in the scene with me, that he runs a blog called The Thoughtful Coal Miner, and he's just a really interesting guy. And I had recommended a bunch of other people. It's supposed to be 2 people. And everybody I introduced them to, they were just like, well, I don't know. I think you should do it. I think you should be in this. And I was like, what? No, I don't want to be on the show. Like, my point is to be behind the scenes, like meddling. And they're like, well, but everything you've said to us on conversations, and it's everything we're wanting to talk about. And Tony will really appreciate, because of his own past with addiction, will I appreciate your opioid crisis understanding and all this. So there I went. I was on the in the breakfast scene, and it was incredible. I mean, he's just it's such a loss. I'm so sad he's gone, because he was such a he's like a healer in some ways. Like, he's just a good listener, and he had all of his opinions, certainly, and was really educated and really smart and did a lot of studying before he went anywhere. But he also was just so open and
Yeah.
not rude. He just had such a great way of approaching conversation. And it's such a loss, but I feel like it was such a gift that they gave the state and the region doing that show, especially right before he was gone. And West Virginia was crying when he died. I mean, the
Really?
show meant a lot. There's so few representation on national media that we as a state can be like, we don't look like idiots, or we aren't being put into, a category that not all of us feel is fair. And so it was amazing. Like, I'll never forget when he tweeted, because I got them access into a coal mine underground, and he tweeted something after that, like, West Virginia is like like, people are the nicest people I've ever met in my life in West Virginia. And like, the whole state was like, what? Anthony Bourdain's here. And it was, it's a small state. So people were like looking for him then.
Yeah.
Um,
And he stands out.
yeah, he's
Yeah.
tall. He was tall, and he was quite skinny. And he's very quiet. He had a way of asking his producers to keep people away from him before the conversation, because he didn't want to get into a good, deep conversation before the cameras were rolling. So that was kind of like strange. Like, you weren't allowed to talk to Tony until the cameras were rolling. But
Yeah.
I mean, I get the process, because like, he's wanting to have that conversation like in a raw way, and he doesn't want people repeating themselves. But my husband was a assistant camera on it too, so they traveled around together, and he got to see a lot more than I did of the making of it. But yeah, I'm really grateful for that episode. I thought they did a beautiful job.
I almost, I mean, I would love to see him, because I feel like the conversations he had were good, but they were obviously, it's a show, they edit it. I don't know if maybe it's a 1 hour conversation, and they edit it
Oh
to
yeah,
2 minutes at best, right? I would
yeah.
love to see like Anthony on like I don't know, a YouTube show or a podcast where you can just talk to someone for an hour, unscripted, unedited.
That would be
No,
such a good idea.
yeah. I'll be honest. When I heard that he took his own life, it didn't really affect me, and I'll tell you why. Because I wasn't like, I only started watching the show last year. So when this happened, I wasn't even really aware. I knew of him, but I didn't
Yeah.
know much about him. And then I essentially started to learn more about him after his passing. And last year, my wife, she's a massive Anthony Bourdain, and she was like, let's watch. I was like, all right, let's try. And I watched one, and I was like, yeah, it's not bad. And I started watching more. And the more I watched, the more I felt almost betrayed in a way. I was like, I'm so invested in this guy, like I really like him, and then he took
Yeah.
his own life, and I almost felt like I had a stake in him. I was like,
Mhm.
dude, I'm invested in you, like I really like you, like I watched all these episodes, and then it almost felt like a betrayal thing. And then like I had to like rewire my. I was like, it's so stupid. He's his own person. It has nothing to do with you. He had his own demons. But I did go through those like emotions while I was watching the show, and the more I watched, the more I actually really liked the guy and really connected with him. So
I
it's
know.
amazing.
And talking about being a bridge and how many bridges we need now to connect people. Um, God, what a bridge he was. Like when I found out he had killed himself, I couldn't believe it either. I just was, you just see his life as being so full, as an outsider looking in. He had a kid and he traveled the world and he was just he had lived through so much already too. Yeah, I've lost several friends to suicide throughout my life, and I can't say that it's a thing that will ever make sense. So I kind of just stopped trying to make sense of it, and it's impossible to be at peace with losing someone like that, though, who was a healer to society in many ways. I mean, whether you just get to know him now or know him all along, and so yeah, I feel bad for the people that worked with him too, because yeah, what a relationship, what a loss.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should look at his life and passing as well, how he probably would have wanted, which is just I don't know, a big party. Just
Yeah.
look at like don't take it too seriously. I think he even mentioned that something like that in one of the episodes. So just celebrate his life, celebrate what he did. He did a lot of good. And you do a lot of good as well. I know you have to go. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I had a blast talking with you.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you for having me. It was
Yeah.
awesome.
Hour flew by. We could have easily done another hour. uh,
Totally.
where are the best places for people to find you? Like we mentioned, the movies are on Netflix. Go check them out. But
Mhm.
if there are any other links, feel free to drop them.
Yep, my website's just Elaine MC Sheldon McSheldon.com. I deleted most of my social media about 4 years ago because I decided it wasn't worth my brain space. But so you can't really find. I mean, I am on Twitter, Elaine McSheldon, I think, and yeah. So email me, I guess, is the best way to get in touch with me. I'm a grandma. Write me a letter.
Yeah, with a pigeon.
Send
Send
it
it
to
with a pigeon.
Tennessee. Send it to the Smoky Mountains. It'll make my way make its way to me.
Hey man, that's what's cool. It comes in waves, man. I'm telling you. Whatever we were doing 60 years ago, it's gonna be cool again in like 10 or 20 years. So you might be ahead of the curve. We'll see.
We'll see.
Well, Elaine, thank you
Oh.
so much. This was a blast, and yeah, I hope we do it again in the future.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great.
All right, take care.